I want to tell you a story about a young man by the name of Khalif Browder. Khalif and his friend were walking home from a party one day, and the police rolled up. And he looks over, and he sees 2 or 3 more police cars pull up. And the police officer gets out of the car, and he says, "I've got a guy who says that you robbed him of his backpack." And this backpack contained a camera, an iPod, credit card, and some cash. And Khalif says, "No, I didn't rob anybody. You can check me." So the officer pats him down and sees that he doesn't have anything. And he says, "Hold on just a second." And so he goes back to the police car, and he says, "You robbed him 2 weeks ago." He says, "I'll tell you what, you come down to the station, and we're going to question you, and then you can go home." But see, Khalif doesn't go home. Khalif is sent to Rikers Island, where he stays for 3 years. 2 of those years in isolation, solitary confinement, where he's starved, tortured, and beat. And this happens on a regular basis. Eventually, New York drops the charges because there wasn't enough evidence to take him to trial. And so Khalif goes home. He gets his GED, and he goes to college where he's an honor student. But he's depressed, and he's having flashbacks and symptoms of PTSD. And one day his mother comes home, and Khalif had committed suicide by hanging an air conditioner cord around his neck. He could no longer take the psychological trauma that he was experiencing from the violence that he has experienced at Rikers Island. The United States locks up more kids than any other country, 2.5 times more. We have up to 54,000 juveniles in jail on any given night. And there's documented evidence in more than half the states with juvenile jails that there's systematic and ongoing physical abuse, sexual abuse, and inappropriate use of isolation week after week after week. Juvenile jails are large, ugly, and loud, and the locked cells where we keep our youth at night are often double and triple bunked. The staff and the kids are caught in their roles of prisoner and guard, and this ongoing struggle of power and resistance. Everything about these places is about aggression and violence, submission and control. In 2015, 42% of juvenile jails reported the use of isolation. 67 reported the use of restraints, handcuffs, leg cuffs, waistbands, leather straps, and restraint chairs. Each state customizes the juvenile code to suit their own needs. That means, for instance, in Louisiana, a 10-year-old can be arrested, convicted, and incarcerated. And until just recently in New York, a 16-year-old was automatically transferred to adult court. That means a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old, an 18-year-old can be charged like an adult, sentenced like an adult, and sent to Rikers Island like an adult. I believe that every one of these youth prisons should be shut down and replaced with something that works. But society says these are dangerous kids. These are predators. There's nothing we can do to help these kids. If we don't lock them away, they'll destroy our communities. But I say these are children, and no child is born bad. When we lock up juveniles, we are creating criminals. Labeling and self-fulfilling prophecy suggest that deviants are constructed by the labels that we assign them, and any opportunity to be anything other than a deviant is not available. He is tagged as a problem. He is that kid with a criminal conviction. Sampson and Laum suggest that labeling undermines social ties to conventional others and leads to blocked opportunities, most notably reduced educational attainment and employment instability. Hence, a formal deviant label could be a turning point in an adolescent's life. What's extremely troubling is the disproportionate number of young already disadvantaged minority men. The minority rate in the juvenile justice system is 2.7 times that of whites. And on any given day in 2000, 1 in 3 young black high school dropouts were in jail. The majority of these kids come from inner urban America. Brown and black kids who are homeless, running from abusive environments, have parents who are addicts or who incarcerated themselves. Home is an unsafe place. School has not been a positive experience, but in their neighborhoods, they have built a resume of experiences that have led to mistrust and resist others, especially the police. These kids are looking for family, people like them, people who share the same experiences. They don't feel loved. You leave a vulnerable kid on the street and they're bound to get in mischief, which often leads to criminal activities. Poor folks, folks of color, born into ghettoization, into child protective services, in failing schools, they are the others, the ones in the peripheral of our imagination. We turn a blind eye when a young black man gets stopped and frisked on the streets for no apparent reason. He probably did something wrong after all, right? We've got to start to learn to care for these people. Disadvantaged neighborhoods offer negative influences. Disadvantaged neighborhoods have high proportion of single families led by females. Poverty and unemployment, when combined, lead to a socioeconomic challenge that contributes to delinquency and youth victimization. Another disconcerting fact is the number of incarcerated youth with addiction and mental health issues. 70% of children and youth who go into the juvenile justice system have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder. That's 2 to 3 times the community at large. And a child with an untreated mental illness will often act out in disruptive, unsafe, and illegal ways. Many of these kids have been swept up in the system through the zero-tolerance policies adopted by our schools. All too often, society wants to control these behaviors by punishing the child instead of addressing the underlying issues. And then once they're in the system, they're not likely to get the help they need. As a matter of fact, they're liable to get worse. Now, I'll be the first to admit that there's some youth who commit very serious crimes that may need to be placed in a secure environment so that they can get the intensive and rehabilitative help that they need. However, a lot of these kids enter the juvenile justice system on minor offenses, status offenses that are illegal only because of their age, such as truancy, underage drinking, and running away from home. In 2015, status offenses accounted for 6%, and property crimes accounted for the majority of juvenile incarcerations. And research has clearly linked status behaviors to future delinquency. And did I say that labeling a child leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy? We have to ask ourselves, what if it was one of our children who got in trouble? What would we want to see happen to them? Would we want to see them cut off from their family and placed with a bunch of other youth who they themselves were in serious trouble, and then they became the only family that your child knew? Would you want to see your child pulled from their school and placed in an educational program where at best only a few kids got a GED? Would you want to see your child in a place where he was told that he had no future and that in fact everything about his identity was formed so that he began to see himself as a hardened criminal? Would you want to see him in a place where he was told 100 times simultaneously that he was dangerous, feared, worthless, and had no future when he got out? Because that's what these institutions do. And then they send them back to their communities where there's little follow-up and no connection to opportunity. Did he make a mistake? Yes, he made a mistake, and he should be held to developmentally appropriate standards of accountability. Brain research has shown that for youth, especially aggressive youth, the prefrontal cortex is instrumental in prioritizing tasks, organizing plans, and controlling impulse has not been developed or has developed slower. So literally, these kids do not have the brains to manage their own behavior. And so the best cure for delinquency is maturity. And knowing this will help us to understand why these youth make poor decisions and to give us the courage to help them. Delinquency is a normal part of adolescence, and most grow out of it. So it's time for us to stand up and be brave and to reach out to these young kids. Spending time in prison or jail can have profound effects on a youth's future. High recidivism rates mean that once a youth enters the system, they're liable to spend a significant portion of their life there. 1/3 of incarcerated youth return to prison within a few years. Diversion programs are alternatives to initial and continued formal processing of youth in the juvenile justice system. The goal of diversion is to remove the youth as early from the system as possible as to avoid the negative outcomes of formal processing, such as high recidivism rates and stigmatization. Most youth can be held accountable and supported in the context of family and community services through processes such as restorative justice, mental health services, mentoring, tutoring, and a wide range of other social services available to the family and youth. Restorative justice programs are not about excusing the crime or letting the child off the hook. Restorative justice asks who has been harmed and seeks to repair that harm appropriately. Carefully nurtured relationships between schools and mental health services, along with training of school staff, create a strong but flexible program to respond to children in need. And for those who say that locking up our children is the only way to save our community, the proof is in the pudding. High recidivism rates in these institutions are 60, 70, and 80%. We are literally building factories of failure, and we're filling those factories of failure with our youth every single day. It's time for us to admit that what we are doing is not working. It is costing billions of dollars and wasting tens of thousands of lives year after year after year. I believe it's time for us to admit that if it were one of our children in trouble, we would do everything in our power to keep them out of one of these institutions. And if we can admit that, we have no moral, ethical, or human obligation but to say, shut down these youth prisons and shut them down today. Thank you.